16 minutes past midnight on June 6, 1944. The nose of Staff Sergeant Jim Wallwork's Horsa glider smashed through German barbed wire and skidded to a violent halt 47 yards from the Caen Canal bridge. The wooden aircraft disintegrated around the men inside. Wallwork and his co-pilot were thrown through the windscreen onto French soil. Major John Howard regained consciousness after a few seconds of blackness, his head ringing from the impact, the metallic taste of blood in his mouth. Equipment scattered around him in the darkness. 28 men from D Company, 2nd Battalion, Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry stumbled from the wreckage into the humid night air of occupied France. They had exactly 10 minutes to capture the bridge before German reinforcements arrived from the nearby garrison. 10 minutes to secure the only escape route eastward from Sword Beach. 10 minutes to prove that men landing from the sky at altitudes most military doctrine considered suicidal could change the course of a war. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The mathematics of their survival had been calculated long before they left England, 300 feet. That was the minimum altitude from which American paratroopers would jump over Normandy in just a few hours. Not the standard 600 feet that training manuals recommended. Not the safe altitude that gave parachutes time to fully deploy and men time to steer away from obstacles. 300 feet meant 1.5 oscillations under canopy before hitting French soil. It meant landing in trees, water, minefields, or directly into German machine gun fire, with almost no time to avoid any of it. It meant that the entire concept of airborne warfare, barely a decade old in 1944, rested on a proposition that sounded insane to anyone who understood physics. Drop lightly armed infantry behind enemy lines from altitudes where a single mechanical failure or a burst of anti-aircraft fire meant certain death. Then expect those scattered, disoriented soldiers to accomplish in minutes what conventional forces might take hours or days to achieve. Major Howard's glider assault on Pegasus Bridge was different only in method, not in madness. Instead of parachutes, his men had relied on pilots flying 70-foot-long wooden gliders through darkness, cutting loose from their Halifax bomber tugs at 7,000 feet over the English Channel, gliding silently across occupied France at 90 miles per hour, and landing with pinpoint precision within yards of their objective. All without engines, without powered controls, navigating by stopwatch and landmarks barely visible in moonlight. The assault that followed was over in 10 minutes. Lieutenant Den Brotheridge led 1st Platoon across the bridge at a dead sprint, firing his Sten gun from the hip, throwing grenades into German defensive positions. A machine gunner in a bunker on the far side of the bridge fired a burst that caught Brotheridge in the neck. He collapsed on the bridge approach and died minutes later, becoming the first Allied soldier killed by enemy fire on D-Day, dying even as his men secured the objective he had led them toward. By 00:26 hours, both the Canal Bridge and the nearby Orne River Bridge were in British hands. The code words, ham and jam, crackled over the radio to waiting commanders in England. This was not supposed to work. Every principle of military aviation said gliders should never attempt precision night landings in combat conditions. Every lesson of the First World War said infantry without armor support or artillery should never assault fortified positions. Every calculation of acceptable risk said the mission's complexity, the number of things that had to go exactly right, made success mathematically improbable. Yet here was Major Howard establishing his command post in the German bunker beside the bridge, organizing his defenses, positioning his thin line of men to hold against the inevitable counterattack, while behind him in England, 13,000 American paratroopers were climbing into C-47 transports, hooking up their static lines, preparing to jump at altitudes that would give many of them less time in the air than it took to read this sentence. The revolution that put them there had begun in panic and desperation 5 years earlier. September 1940. German Fallschirmjäger paratroopers seized Fort Eben-Emael in Belgium through a glider assault that military analysts across Europe had declared impossible. The fort, considered impregnable with walls designed to withstand the heaviest artillery bombardment, fell to 78 men who landed on its roof in 9 gliders and used shaped charges to blow through the steel cupolas protecting the gun positions. The fort surrendered after 24 hours of siege. 4 months earlier, German airborne forces had captured critical bridges in the Netherlands and Belgium before Dutch and Belgian engineers could destroy them, allowing panzer divisions to bypass defensive lines that were supposed to hold for weeks and reach the English Channel in 10 days of lightning warfare. American and British military planners watched these operations with a mixture of awe and terror. If Germany could deploy thousands of trained paratroopers and glider infantry to seize objectives behind enemy lines, to appear from the sky where defenders least expected attack, what prevented them from doing the same to Britain? What stopped German transports from flying across the Channel at night and dropping paratroopers directly onto British airfields, bridges, and command centres, while the British Army waited at the coast for an amphibious invasion that never came? The answer was nothing. Absolutely nothing prevented it, except British air superiority over the Channel and the 20 miles of water that separated the coasts. And that realization drove the immediate formation of British and American airborne forces, not because the technology was ready or the doctrine proven, but because the alternative was waiting passively for the enemy to perfect a capability and then use it against you when you had no counter. The United States Army created its first parachute test platoon in June 1940 at Fort Benning, Georgia. 48 volunteers from the 29th Infantry Regiment learned to jump using the same kind of equipment that civilian sport parachutists used, because military-specific gear didn't exist yet. They jumped from 250-foot towers, then from aircraft flying at increasingly lower altitudes, teaching themselves through trial and error, through broken bones and hard landings, what would keep them alive and what would kill them. The British formed the 1st Parachute Brigade in September 1940, pulling volunteers from infantry regiments and putting them through training that casualties made terrifyingly real from the beginning. Early training jumps killed and injured enough men that commanders realized the standard procedures adapted from civilian parachuting weren't adequate for the demands of combat conditions. Military jumps required different equipment, different training, different assumptions about acceptable risk. Both nations faced the same fundamental problem. Civilian parachutists jumped for sport from aircraft flying slowly at high altitudes, giving them time to deploy reserve chutes if the main canopy failed, time to steer away from obstacles, time to prepare mentally and physically for landing. Combat jumps required exactly the opposite conditions. Speed was essential to avoid anti-aircraft fire and minimize the aircraft's exposure to ground defenses. Low altitude was essential to minimize time under canopy when paratroopers were completely vulnerable, floating helplessly while every German soldier with a rifle could shoot at them. Mass drops were essential to concentrate forces quickly before defenders. It could organize resistance. But speed, low altitude, and mass drops multiplied every risk inherent in parachuting. Paratroopers exiting aircraft at 150 miles per hour instead of 90 experienced violent opening shocks that could cause injury, equipment failure, or both. Jumping from 300 feet instead of 600 meant parachutes had to open faster and more reliably, with no margin for error. Mass drops from multiple aircraft flying in formation meant mid-air collisions between paratroopers, tangled parachutes, and clusters of men landing in the same confined areas where German machine guns could sweep them all with sustained fire. The mathematics were brutal and unavoidable. Higher altitude meant more time under canopy, which meant more casualties from ground fire as defenders tracked slowly descending targets. Lower altitude meant less time for parachute malfunctions to be resolved, which meant more casualties from impact when chutes failed to deploy properly. There was no perfect answer, only the least terrible compromise between competing ways to die. American doctrine settled on 600 feet and 90 miles per hour as the standard parameters for training jumps. This gave paratroopers approximately 25 to 30 seconds from exit to ground contact, enough time for the T-5 parachute to deploy fully, and for the trooper to assess his landing zone and prepare for ground contact. It was high enough that reserve parachutes could be deployed if the main chute malfunctioned. It was low enough that ground fire had limited time to track descending targets before they reached the relative safety of the ground. But 600 feet was a training standard, not a combat guarantee. When aircraft encountered anti-aircraft fire over enemy territory, pilots took evasive action that scattered paratroopers across miles of countryside. When weather obscured drop zones, pilots climbed above the clouds to navigate by instruments, then descended rapidly to drop altitude, leaving paratroopers sick and disoriented from the violent maneuvers. When pathfinders failed to mark drop zones accurately with their lights and radar beacons, pilots had to make split-second decisions about whether to drop their sticks where they were or circle back for another pass through enemy fire. The training that prepared men for these conditions was as close to actual combat as peacetime operations allowed. At Fort Benning, volunteers learned to exit aircraft at full speed, experienced the violent opening shock of military parachutes loaded with equipment, and practiced landing at night while carrying 150 pounds of weapons, ammunition, and supplies. The 34-foot towers taught them to control their descent and prepare for ground contact. The 250-foot towers taught them to overcome the instinctive fear of jumping from heights. The actual jumps from C-47 aircraft taught them that no amount of training fully prepared you for the moment you stood in the door, watching the earth rushing up at you through darkness. Men who couldn't handle the physical demands of the training or the psychological pressure of jumping from aircraft washed out before completing the 5 qualifying jumps required to earn their silver paratrooper wings. Those who succeeded received $50 per month jump pay, hazardous duty pay that acknowledged what everyone knew but rarely said aloud. Jumping out of aircraft was inherently dangerous even in peacetime training conditions with safety officers watching. In combat, with German 88mm anti-aircraft shells that could obliterate a C-47 transport in a single direct hit, the survival rate would be determined by luck and training in roughly equal measure. By mid-1943, the United States had activated 5 airborne divisions, the 11th, 13th, 17th, 82nd, and 101st. The 82nd and 101st would become the most famous, seeing extensive combat in Europe, but all 5 divisions trained using the same basic doctrine and methods. Paratroopers were light infantry, emphasizing speed, mobility, and shock action over sustained firepower. They carried rifles, machine guns, mortars, and bazookas, but no tanks or heavy artillery that required specialized transport. They jumped with ammunition, rations, and medical supplies sufficient for 3 days of combat operations, after which they expected conventional armored or infantry forces to reach them and provide resupply. The operational concept was straightforward in theory. Drop paratroopers behind enemy lines to seize bridges, road junctions, and causeways that conventional forces needed for their advance. Disrupt enemy communications and supply lines by cutting telephone wires, destroying ammunition dumps, and creating chaos in headquarters areas. Force the enemy to divert forces from the front lines to hunt down scattered parachute units operating in their rear areas. Hold key terrain features until relieved by armored or infantry divisions moving up from the beachhead or breakthrough point. What made this concept terrifying in practice was that it relied entirely on things working approximately as planned. Paratroopers dropped miles behind enemy lines, far from friendly forces, had no armor support to protect them from German tanks. They had no artillery support beyond the 60mm mortars and 81mm mortars they could carry, and ammunition they could jump with. They had limited ammunition that couldn't be resupplied except by additional airdrops. If they were surrounded and couldn't be relieved within the planned time frame, they would be systematically destroyed by superior German forces. If they were scattered too widely during the drop to assemble into effective combat units, they would be hunted down in small groups and eliminated. If the beach landings failed and the relief never came, the airborne divisions would be cut off deep in enemy territory and overwhelmed. The 82nd Airborne's first combat jump proved every one of these fears justified. On November 8, 1942, 531 men from the 2nd Battalion, 509th Parachute Infantry Regiment, flew 1,600 miles at night from Britain over neutral Spain toward Algeria, intending to drop near Oran and capture 2 critical airfields as part of Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of North Africa. Navigation errors, communications problems, and unexpected bad weather scattered the forces across hundreds of miles of desert. Only 10 of the 39 C-47 aircraft actually delivered their troops by parachute drop. The remainder landed on dry lake beds when they ran dangerously low on fuel or flew back to Gibraltar after becoming hopelessly lost in the darkness. 1 week later, 304 men from the same battalion repacked their own parachutes by hand and conducted a second combat jump to secure an airfield near the Tunisian border. The lessons learned were written in blood: missed drop zones, injured men landing on rocky terrain, and objectives that took far longer to capture than planned. But the battalion had proven the fundamental concept worked. Paratroopers could be delivered behind enemy lines and could accomplish their tactical missions if enough of them reached approximately the right place at approximately the right time. The lessons were refined and expanded in Sicily in July 1943, when the 82nd Airborne conducted larger-scale jumps as part of the Allied invasion of that island. But Sicily also revealed the deadliest threat to airborne operations that couldn't be eliminated through better training or equipment. Allied naval vessels, made nervous by days of German air attacks, opened fire on formations of American C-47 transports carrying paratroopers from the 82nd Airborne Division during a night drop. 23 aircraft were shot down by friendly fire from ships that were supposed to be protecting them. Several hundred paratroopers were killed or wounded by American and British anti-aircraft guns before they ever had a chance to jump from their planes or fight German soldiers. The massacre drove immediate changes in aircraft identification procedures and coordination protocols. But it couldn't eliminate the fundamental problem that airborne operations put slow, unarmed transport aircraft over territory where every gun on the ground, friendly or enemy, had strong incentive to shoot first and identify targets later. The British faced similar challenges in their early airborne operations. Their first major combat jump came in North Africa, where weather and navigation problems scattered paratroopers across miles of empty desert. Their second came in Sicily, where gliders landing at night in unfamiliar terrain crashed into stone walls, ancient olive trees, and each other, killing dozens of men before they could contribute to the battle. But the British also demonstrated convincingly what gliders could accomplish when everything worked correctly according to plan. At Syracuse in Sicily, British glider infantry seized a critical bridge intact before Italian engineers could activate demolition charges, allowing British armour to advance rapidly inland from the invasion beaches instead of being bottlenecked on the coast. Gliders offered distinct advantages that parachutes could not match. A glider load of troops landed concentrated in one location and ready to fight immediately, not scattered across miles of countryside needing hours to assemble. Gliders could carry heavy weapons that couldn't be parachuted safely, including jeeps, anti-tank guns, and even light tanks that gave airborne forces capabilities normally restricted to conventional ground forces. And gliders were silent in their final approach, descending, without the distinctive roar of aircraft engines that advertised parachute drops from miles away and gave defenders time to prepare. But gliders magnified certain risks to levels that made even experienced pilots nervous. They required extraordinarily skilled pilots who could navigate at night using only stopwatches and landmark recognition, find tiny landing zones in complete darkness, and touch down at speeds approaching 100 miles per hour without engines, without powered flight controls, without the ability to abort the landing and try again. They were fragile, their wooden frames breaking apart catastrophically on impact if they hit obstacles like trees, walls, or ditches that were invisible in darkness. And once on the ground, gliders were useless pieces of lumber, providing no cover from enemy fire and no means of escape if the situation deteriorated. The debate over parachutes versus gliders consumed endless planning sessions at every level of command. American doctrine generally favored parachutes for their flexibility and the speed with which paratroopers could assemble after landing and move toward objectives. British doctrine generally favored gliders for their ability to concentrate force in a single location and deliver heavy weapons that parachute units couldn't employ. Both nations eventually adopted combined arms approaches, using both parachute and glider infantry in the same operations, recognizing that different tactical missions required different insertion methods. What nobody disputed by early 1944 was that any major airborne operation required accepting extraordinary casualties as the price of achieving tactical surprise behind enemy lines. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The military planning staffs preparing for Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy, calculated that up to 70% of paratroopers might be killed, wounded, or captured in the initial drops and the first hours of combat. They planned for it. They accepted it as operationally necessary. Because the alternative was attempting an amphibious invasion of a heavily defended coastline without securing the flanks of the beachhead against German counterattack, which analysis showed would result in even higher casualties among the infantry divisions landing from the sea, and potentially cause the entire invasion to fail. This cold, brutal mathematics meant that when Allied planners designed the airborne component of Operation Overlord, they weren't trying to minimize casualties among airborne forces. They were trying to ensure that the casualties achieved their strategic and tactical purposes. 3 complete airborne divisions, British and American, would drop on both flanks of the 5 invasion beaches during the hours of darkness before the amphibious landings. The American 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions would secure the western flank behind Utah Beach, the westernmost of the American landing zones. The British 6th Airborne Division would secure the eastern flank behind Sword Beach, the easternmost of the British landing zones. Their objectives were brutally specific and mission-critical. Capture the causeway exits leading inland from Utah Beach, so the 4th Infantry Division could advance off the beach and into the Norman countryside. Capture and hold the bridges over the Murderette River to prevent German armor from reaching the beaches during the critical first hours. Destroy the bridges over the Dives River to prevent German reinforcements from approaching the landing zones from the east. Capture intact the bridges over the Caen Canal and Orne River to secure the eastern flank and prevent German forces from rolling up the British beaches from that direction. Destroy or neutralize the Merville Battery, whose heavy guns could enfilade Sword Beach and slaughter troops in their landing craft. Every one of these objectives required men to land in darkness in enemy territory, assemble under fire, and assault. Fortified positions without the benefit of armor support, artillery support, or air support. Every objective assumed that enough men would reach approximately the right places at approximately the right times to accomplish missions that would be difficult, even for full-strength units with all their equipment and full communications capability. The planning staffs knew with certainty that the drops would be scattered by darkness, weather, enemy fire, and pilot error. They knew men would land in the flooded fields that Field Marshal Rommel had ordered, created specifically to drown paratroopers. They knew men would land in trees and be shot while hanging helplessly in their harnesses. They knew that anti-aircraft fire would destroy some transports and kill entire sticks of paratroopers before they could exit the aircraft. They planned for all of it, calculating that if 30% of the paratroopers reached their assigned objectives and accomplished their assigned missions, the overall operation would succeed. 30%. That was the threshold of acceptable operational effectiveness. 70% casualties were not a worst-case scenario requiring contingency planning. They were the baseline planning assumption upon which the entire operation was built. Major General Richard Gale, commanding the British 6th Airborne Division, received his operational orders in February 1944. His division would protect the eastern flank of the entire invasion by seizing critical bridges, destroying German artillery batteries, and holding the high ground east of the Orne River against the inevitable German counterattack that would come from that direction. The linchpin of his entire divisional plan was Operation Deadstick, later renamed Operation Coup de Main in official histories, the glider assault on what would become known as Pegasus Bridge over the Caen Canal and Horsa Bridge over the Orne River. Gale understood with absolute clarity that these bridges were strategically critical. If German armour could cross the Caen Canal, it could strike directly into the flank and rear of British forces landing at Sword Beach, rolling up the beachhead before reinforcements could arrive. If British forces couldn't cross the Orne River to advance eastward, they would be trapped in a narrow salient between the river and the sea, vulnerable to concentrated German artillery fire and counterattack. The bridges had to be captured intact, and they had to be captured immediately in the first minutes of the invasion, before German engineers could activate the demolition charges that intelligence reports indicated were already installed and wired for detonation. The mission required surgical precision, executed in complete darkness by men who would be disoriented from the violent glider landing, possibly injured by the impact, and under immediate fire from German defenders who were literally sleeping within yards of the bridges. Gale selected D Company of the Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry for this mission because they were, without question, the best infantry unit in his entire division. He selected Major John Howard to command the operation because Howard had a reputation for driving his men harder than any other officer in the division and for demanding absolute perfection in training exercises. Training for the Pegasus Bridge assault began in earnest in early 1944 and continued with increasing intensity through the spring. Howard's men practiced assaulting replica bridges that had been constructed in England to match exactly the dimensions and defensive layout of their actual objectives in France. They practiced at night, in pouring rain, in high winds, under simulated artillery fire, until every single man in the company could navigate the entire assault sequence by touch and memory alone. They practiced exiting crashed gliders in complete darkness in under 10 seconds. They practiced clearing German-style bunkers and trenches under simulated fire while wearing gas masks to further reduce their vision and mobility. Howard himself personally supervised every microscopic detail of the preparation. He memorized the aerial photographs of both bridges until he could draw them from memory. He studied intelligence reports from the French resistance about German defensive positions, patrol schedules, and the personalities of the German officers commanding the bridge garrisons. He walked his platoon leaders through every phase of the assault plan dozens of times, wargaming every possible failure scenario and planning contingencies. When glider pilot Staff Sergeant Jim Wallwork told him bluntly that the Horsa gliders would be dangerously overloaded with all the men and equipment Howard wanted to bring, Howard made the brutal but necessary decision to leave 2 men from each platoon behind in England, reducing his assault force but increasing the mathematical probability that the overloaded gliders could actually reach the target area. The training was so realistic and demanding that men were injured in training accidents that mimicked combat conditions. One glider crashed during a practice landing exercise, killing both pilots instantly. The men of D Company attended the military funeral and resumed their training the very next day. They had been selected for this mission because they were elite soldiers. They would prove they deserved that designation, or they would die trying. By late May 1944, D Company knew their exact objective, understood the detailed plan, and had internalized the extraordinary risks. What they didn't know was the specific date the invasion would begin. They waited at RAF Tarrant Rushton Airfield in Dorset, their gliders already loaded with equipment, their personal weapons cleaned and test-fired, their assault boats secured and ready. When General Eisenhower's order finally came on the evening of June 5th, postponed by one day due to weather, some men tried to sleep during the afternoon. Most couldn't manage it. They wrote final letters home that they hoped would never need to be delivered. They checked their equipment one final time, even though they had already checked it 100 times before. They climbed into their gliders and waited in the cramped darkness for the Halifax bombers to start their engines. At 22:56 hours on June 5, 1944, the first Halifax bomber roared down the runway with its Horsa glider in tow behind it, the rope connecting them taut with strain. 5 more Halifax glider combinations followed at precisely 1-minute intervals. 181 men were on their way to France. Fewer than 150 would survive to see the dawn. Across southern England that same evening, hundreds more C-47 transport aircraft were being prepared for the largest airborne operation in history. 13,000 American paratroopers from the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions were boarding their assigned aircraft, their faces blackened with camouflage paint, their equipment checked and rechecked by jumpmaster inspection. Each man carried more than 150 pounds of personal gear distributed across his body. Main parachute on his back, reserve parachute strapped to his chest, M1 Garand rifle broken down into 3 pieces and secured in a padded Griswold bag for the jump, 6 to 10 loaded ammunition clips, 4 to 9 fragmentation grenades, rations for 3 days, 2 canteens of water, first aid kit, entrenching tool, gas mask that most knew they would discard as soon as possible after landing. Some men needed help from their buddies just to stand up under the crushing weight of all this equipment. It took a full 5 minutes for a paratrooper to pull on his parachute harness over all the other gear he was already wearing. The heavy combat loads were absolutely necessary. Paratroopers were being dropped miles behind enemy lines with no possibility of resupply except by additional airdrops. Everything they needed to fight and survive for 3 days of combat operations had to be on their bodies or in the equipment bags that would hang below them during the descent. The jumpmaster's briefing was identical in every aircraft across every airfield. Stand up, hook up, equipment check. When the red warning light near the door turned green and the jumpmaster shouted, "Go," they would shuffle forward in their stick and throw themselves out into the darkness over France. The aircraft would be flying fast, between 100 and 150 miles per hour, to minimize exposure to German anti-aircraft fire. The exit from the aircraft would be violent, the wind blast hitting them like a physical wall. The opening shock when the parachute deployed would be brutal, like being kicked by a horse, and the ground would come up faster than anything they had experienced in peaceful training jumps back in the United States. Because the pilots had already been told, in classified briefings that the paratroopers were not privy to, that if they encountered heavy flak or couldn't locate their assigned drop zones in the darkness and confusion, they were authorized to drop their sticks from whatever altitude the pilot judged survivable. That meant some paratroopers would jump from the regulation 600 feet that training manuals specified. Others would jump from 300 feet or even lower if the pilot was flying low to avoid anti-aircraft fire. Some would jump from aircraft that had climbed to 2,000 feet, trying desperately to get above the cloud layers and anti-aircraft fire. The extreme variation in jump altitude would scatter the drops even more severely than the darkness and enemy fire alone would have caused. Men jumping from 600 feet in the same stick would drift for 30 seconds under canopy, covering hundreds of yards horizontally if any. Wind was blowing. Men jumping from 300 feet would have only 15 seconds under canopy, barely enough time to look down and see the ground rushing up at them before impact. The altitude difference alone meant that paratroopers exiting from the same aircraft door only seconds apart would land hundreds of yards from each other, based purely on which position they held in the stick. Nobody bothered telling the men packed into the C-47 transports that the mission planning staff had calculated a 70% casualty rate for the first 24 hours of operations. Nobody told them that German military intelligence had correctly identified several of the likely American drop zones and had positioned troops with machine guns to massacre paratroopers as they landed helplessly. Nobody told them that the fields and marshes below had been deliberately flooded on Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's personal orders, because Rommel understood with crystal clarity that paratroopers weighed down with 150 pounds of equipment would drown in 4 feet of water that they could have easily waded through without the crushing weight on their backs. What the men sitting in those transport aircraft knew was simpler and more immediate than abstract casualty statistics. They knew that in approximately 1 hour, they would either be on the ground fighting in France, or they would be dead. They knew their best friends were sitting beside them in the aircraft, that they had trained together for months, and that loyalty to those friends mattered more in this moment than abstract fear of death. They knew that thousands of soldiers were climbing into landing craft on ships in the English Channel, heading toward beaches where German machine guns and artillery would cut them down by the hundreds if the airborne forces failed to secure the causeways and eliminate the coastal artillery batteries. The jumpmaster called out altitudes and times as the formations crossed the Creeless, English Channel. The men sat in silence, alone with their thoughts, checking and rechecking equipment they had already checked a dozen times, because having something to do with your hands was better than sitting still and thinking about what was coming. Some men prayed, others slept somehow despite the engine noise and vibration. A few joked and laughed with the forced bravado that soldiers have used to mask fear since the beginning of warfare. Private Lou Merlano of the 101st Airborne Division sat in his assigned C-47 and watched England disappearing beneath him through the open door, the countryside dark except for the occasional blacked-out town. The aircraft was flying at 500 feet over the English Channel, low enough to stay under German radar coverage that might have detected the massive formation and given warning. The formation stretched for miles, nearly 1,000 aircraft carrying 13,000 American paratroopers, all heading toward the same narrow stretch of French coastline, all trying to arrive within the same compressed 30-minute time window. As the formation crossed the French coast shortly after midnight, the aircraft began climbing to jump altitude, or at least they tried to climb to regulation altitude. Thick cloud banks obscured the ground and made navigation by visual landmarks impossible. Anti-aircraft fire erupted from German positions that had been on high alert since midnight, when the first British bombers had started hitting targets around the city of Caen. The carefully planned tight formations began to disintegrate almost immediately, as pilots took violent evasive action, dove under the clouds searching desperately for visual contact with the ground, or climbed above the clouds trying to navigate by dead reckoning and instruments. Milano's aircraft dropped suddenly and steeply. The pilot was diving under the cloud bank, pushing down aggressively to get below the obscuring weather and establish visual contact with the dark French countryside below. When the red warning light flashed on inside the cargo bay and the jumpmaster screamed for everyone to stand up and hook up their static lines, Milano could physically feel through his boots that the aircraft was still descending, still pushing lower, the pilot hunting desperately for his assigned drop zone in the darkness and confusion. The green light came on. The jumpmaster physically shoved the first man out the door. Milano shuffled forward with the rest of his stick, each man pressed close behind the next, moving as fast as the heavy equipment would allow. He jumped at approximately 300 feet. After 1.5 oscillations under his parachute canopy, he hit the Norman soil with a brutal impact that knocked all the wind from his lungs and left him gasping. He was in Normandy, in an open field marked with a wooden sign that read "Minen" in faded German letters. At the time, he didn't know it was a dummy minefield that the Germans had marked to deter their own soldiers from crossing it. He moved through it very cautiously, expecting at any second to trigger a mine that would blow him apart. He eventually found other paratroopers scattered across adjacent fields, and they assembled into an improvised fighting unit. Milano was extraordinarily lucky by the standards of that chaotic night. His main parachute had opened properly at dangerously low altitude. He had landed in an open field, not in a flooded area where he would have drowned, not in a tree where he would have hung helpless under German fire. His equipment had stayed attached to his body during the violent descent and hard landing, and he had found his unit, or at least elements of several units, relatively quickly in the darkness. Thousands of other American paratroopers scattered across Normandy that night were not nearly as fortunate. Private Nick Cortez from the 101st Airborne Division landed in what he later described in official debriefing as the biggest tree in all of Normandy. His equipment bag containing an SCR-300 radio hung suspended in one part of the tree, while he himself dangled from his parachute harness in another section, unable to reach the ground or his equipment. 50 yards away across an open field, a haystack burned fiercely from German tracer fire, casting dancing shadows across the Norman landscape. Beyond the burning hay, a German machine gun nest fired continuously at other descending paratroopers, the distinctive sound of the MG-42 ripping through the night at 1,200 rounds per minute. Cortez spent what felt like hours, but was probably closer to 30 minutes, cutting himself free from his harness with his jump knife and climbing down using his nylon jump rope, the entire time expecting a German bullet to find him hanging helplessly in the branches. Corporal Edward Krauss of the 82nd Airborne Division had a completely different problem during his descent. While still under canopy and descending toward the Norman countryside, 4 separate C-47 aircraft passed underneath his position, their wings coming terrifyingly close to his parachute suspension lines. He pulled frantically on his risers, trying desperately to steer his canopy away from the aircraft, absolutely certain that at any moment a C-47 wing would slice through his suspension lines and send him plummeting 200 feet straight down to his death. Guy Remington of the 101st Airborne Division watched the full, horrifying panorama of chaos unfold around him as he descended helplessly under his parachute. The black Norman fields and hedgerows tilted and turned far beneath him. German flares arced up from defensive positions, bathing the landscape in harsh chemical light. Instantly, machine guns and 40mm anti-aircraft guns began firing from positions at the corners of fields and along hedgerows, stripping the night sky with streams of yellow, green, blue, and red tracer rounds that arced up toward the descending paratroopers. He felt like he was falling through a wild 4th of July fireworks display turned deadly. Fire licked through the sky and blazed around the silhouettes of transport aircraft, heaving and twisting overhead as pilots tried to evade the ground fire. He saw several C-47 seconds go plunging down, trailing flames and black smoke. One aircraft came down with a paratrooper whose parachute had caught in the tailpiece, the man's body streaming out behind the doomed plane like a grotesque banner. He heard the loud gush of air as another man went hurtling past him only a few yards away, his parachute collapsed and burning, falling like a stone toward the dark earth below. The drops that were supposed to concentrate American forces in specific, carefully selected zones instead scattered paratroopers across the entire Cotentin Peninsula. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions had been assigned distinct drop zones miles apart, with clear unit boundaries and specific tactical objectives for each regiment and battalion. The reality on the ground bore no resemblance to the neat coloured maps in the planning rooms back in England. Men from both divisions were scattered across 50 square miles of Norman countryside. Some landed directly on their assigned objectives through extraordinary luck. Others landed 10 miles away from where they were supposed to be, in the wrong divisional sector, sometimes even behind the wrong beach entirely. Battalion commanders, who were supposed to be directing 600 men, found themselves alone in dark fields, or accompanied by only a handful of soldiers from various units. One battalion commander roamed alone through enemy territory for 5 consecutive days, killing 6 German soldiers in various encounters without ever finding another American soldier or linking up with any organized unit. Some troopers who landed near French villages broke into abandoned houses and got drunk on bottles of Calvados apple brandy they found in cellars, unable to cope with the stress and terror. Others displayed exactly the kind of aggressive initiative that the elite airborne training was designed to instill, forming improvised scratch units from whoever they could find in the darkness, and moving immediately toward the sound of gunfire. Only about 1/3 of American paratroopers managed to assemble themselves under organized leadership with their proper units in the first crucial hours after landing. The other 2/3 were scattered, lost, isolated, or dead. The scattering that appeared to be a catastrophic operational failure actually created an unexpected strategic benefit that nobody had planned for or anticipated. German commanders throughout Normandy received frantic reports of parachute landings coming from every direction simultaneously. They believed they were facing an airborne force several times larger than the actual 13,000 men who had jumped. German infantry and armor units spent the critical hours of darkness responding to reports of enemy paratroopers landing in their rear areas, fragmenting their forces and preventing them from concentrating for a decisive counterattack against the actual invasion beaches. But for the men on the ground, trying to accomplish specific tactical missions, the scattering meant that operations that were supposed to be accomplished by full companies or battalions were instead being attempted by undermanned platoons or improvised squads. The 101st Airborne Division's primary operational objective was capturing and holding the causeway exits leading inland from Utah Beach. These were narrow, elevated roads built across flooded marshland, the only routes by which vehicles and heavy equipment could advance off the beach. If the 4th Infantry Division landing at Utah Beach couldn't advance inland through these causeways, they would be trapped on the narrow strip of sand, while German reinforcements surrounded them, and German artillery destroyed them systematically. The 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment was supposed to drop in concentrated regimental strength near the critical town of Sainte-Mère-Église, and secure the causeway leading directly from Utah Beach to that key road, junction. Instead, the regiment was scattered across miles of countryside in dozens of small groups. Some paratroopers landed directly in Sainte-Mère-Église itself, where German soldiers were actively fighting a building fire near the town square that had been started by Allied bombing. The paratroopers descended into streets brightly lit by the flames of the burning building, and German soldiers shot them methodically as they hung helplessly in their parachute harnesses or struggled frantically to shed their parachutes and reach cover. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.